Okay, gonna start early today for a variety of reasons. This is a long piece, but I do want to get to the end of it. So, without further ado, be do, be do. Welcome, April 25th. Dis and dat information on the autonomouscollective.network.net. Sorry. We're going to finish up with the introduction to unequal exchange and the prospects of socialism. And we're going to do the epilogue today, probably the more important part because it does address the current situation. This is a reprint of a text put out in 1985-86, and it's a piece of history on the one hand. On the other hand, a lot of the same folks are still around, and it does cover probably an interesting moment in what we might call a new left or a variety of other things, a document of part of the left, history of the left in Denmark. So it has all of those elements as well. Excuse me. The text is, I've included some videos for Torkil Lausen. He's still around and doing still stuff on unequal exchange, especially unequal exchange in the 21st century. There's a coverage of Aguirre Emanuel's book, chapter by chapter, and all those are available on YouTube. But what we're looking at today is the epilogue, um, and the authors are Communist Working Group. Um, the new preface is done by our friend Henry Hekamaki and Nemanja Lukic, and it just came out last week. Uh, Unequal exchange and the prospects of socialism is, and as we talked about yesterday, one of the clearest, most uncompromising anti-imperialist texts of the late 20th century. And it is a sharp and accessible analysis, which we'll get to today, of how global capitalism extracts value from the global south through unequal exchange, and how that extraction shapes class complicity within the imperial core. And I've mentioned further before about uneven development, which is Neil Smith's idea about geographically how things go. It is no different. The idea is that there's a kind of asymmetry. Um, Back to the days when I was an undergraduate, there was discussion of capital exports, and that was the euphemistic way of talking about this same kind of idea. But in fact, capital exports happened all through the late 19th century and early 20th century. It is, in fact, how capitalist economies grew. And needless to say, uh, people were unabashed colonialists in that particular context. Now, yes, there is algebra in the book, but probably I included probably the total of what is algebraic. But I just as a reminder, there is a structure for this. It is analytic. It's not as synthetic as one might think of it. The value of the labor power and the value created by the laborer during the working process are two different quantities. The created value, the increase in value, consists of the value which exceeds the value of the labor power. Or, in other words, the value which exceeds the time when the laborer has performed a piece of work corresponding to the work necessary to produce the commodities which the labor buys for his wages. And this is about sustenance, about, keeping your family whole. Only the living labor power, can be the source of created value. Now, that's arguable, of course. The means of production which the capitalist bought to start his production changed their shape, for example, from leather to shoes, but their value does not change. Also arguable, they maintain their value which is transferred to the finished commodities to the same extent as the means of production are used during the production. Now, the following stage is again in the trade in commodities where the appropriation of the value takes place. In order to make it possible for the capitalist to secure all of the created value, it's important that the finished commodities be sold at their value. This means that the total capital outlay for variable capital and constant capital plus the surplus value. If they succeed, the capitalist has increased the original capital by the surplus value. It can be used productively, i.e., for a new expanded circulation, or unproductively, for consumption. The total circulation of capital appears as below. This is the diagram used in the text. You can see this is a very standard thing, and even from the 1980s, it's not that different now. There's means of production, constant capital, variable capital, small v, constant capital, small c. Variable capital is labor power. On the left is capital. It is devoted to means. This is the circuit, right? Means of production, variable, and labor power are put together. MP and LP are involved in the production process of making commodities. Below, which is big V equals little v plus little c plus little s, that enters into commodity exchange, buying and selling, the market. And increased capital is C prime equals big C plus little s. And then hence, some gets skimmed off and then capital gets put back into the process. Fairly simple, we hope. Figure 2. Figure 3 is taking the S value, dividing it by variable capital and getting the S prime, and that is the rate of surplus value, and then, which is not identical, although resembles. And there's, this is the crux of much ink being spilled. Little s gets divided by big C, which is aggregate capital, big C, which equals small p prime, which is the rate of profit, or pi in some instances. And then there's this idea in figure 5 of cost price, which is a fairly standard term. And price of production equals cost price plus total used capital times the average rate of profit. That's pretty much all the math you need. Here's the abbreviations and their definitions and the associated formula, and there's not much difference from then till now. Now, epilogue. I just wanted to point out that there is a sort of a standard structure in there that's not that horribly different, and it hasn't changed that much since the 1980s. Or since the 1880s. Epilogue, The Task of the New Stage by Torkil Lawson. The end of our praxis. Up through the 1980s, the illegal work was intensified. At the same time, our small organization, together with sympathizers, ran the cafe and restaurant called Liberation. The development of theory continued with studies of the capitalist crises and the developments in the Soviet Union and the Third World. This was reflected in publications from Manifest Press. At the end of the 1980s, with the decline of the Third World liberation struggles and the general crises in the struggle for socialism, it became difficult to mobilize new activists for the cafe and find new prospects to become members of MCWG. This is the Manifest wing of the CWG, the working group. Between the increased workload and getting older, we might have been feeling a bit tired and incautious. Our illegal practice ended suddenly on April 13th, 1989, when 6 comrades, including me, were arrested. There was not one single mistake that led to arrest, but cumulative incidents over the years, and our occasional negligence allowed the police to track us down. However, there was no hard evidence, and we were to be released within 48 hours. But shortly after our arrest, a comrade, in the process of cleaning up evidence, was gravely injured in an automobile accident. His car was full of incriminating evidence, including a phone bill with the address of our safe house. This allowed the authorities to put us on trial. We were found guilty of 1 robbery and other criminal acts and sentenced to 10 years in prison effectively meaning the end of our group. And there is actually a little story about that in more complete terms in this little book, Turning Money into Rebellion. Reflection and evaluation. At this point, it might be appropriate to reflect on the question raised by CWC. Is it possible to build a revolutionary organization in a capitalist welfare state like Denmark? Furthermore, we should reevaluate the strategy and game plan of CWC, that is, supporting the Third World Revolution to cut the pipeline of value transfer to the imperialist center in order to create a revolutionary situation at home. Concerning the first question, is it possible to build a revolutionary organization in a country where the socioeconomic conditions do not make radical change an imperative? The transition towards socialism is not an act of will alone, nor is it a mechanical process of history. It is driven by the dialectic between the objective conditions for transformation and the subjective forces. There are many reasons why people want socialism. Some want socialism because they can hardly earn a living despite hard work. Others want socialism because capitalism is in the process of destroying the Earth's ecosystem, or, as we have seen, because it leads to war. Without anger and a burning desire to change the world, that is, this is the subjective forces or the collective subject, it is not possible to mobilize and organize the objective forces that will create a radical change. However, it is also a common experience that revolutions do not occur just because people want it. In North America and Europe, the movements of 1968 put socialism on the agenda. However, this wave fizzled out. The possibility of radical change depends on not only the will of these subjective forces, it also depends on the development of the contradictions within the mode of production, as above. The possibility for the development of the productive forces on one side, and on the other side, that of the relations of production. The prospects of revolution are determined by whether the relations of production promote or inhibit the development of the productive forces. The status of that contradiction is what we call the material or objective conditions for revolution. As Marx states, at a certain stage of development, the material productive forces of society come into conflict with the existing relations of production. From forms of development of the productive forces, these relations turn into their fetters. Then begins an era of social revolution. However, no social order is ever destroyed before all the productive forces for which it is sufficient have been developed. And new superior relations of production never replace older ones before the material conditions for their existence have matured within the framework of the old society. This is a very important point. It is what, it's the criticism of adventurism or vanguardism. A positive socialist outcome is not given, and it is not only determined by the contradiction between the productive forces and the relations of production. So it just means there's a lot of other stuff going on. The outcome also depends on how prepared the proletariat is ideologically, politically, and organizationally. Thus, the development of capitalism is determined by the dialectical relationship between the economic laws that govern accumulation and the class struggle induced by the social consequences of these laws. By polarizing the world system in an imperialist center and exploited periphery, capitalism managed to find a mode of production in which the development of the productive forces could continue. The productive forces in Europe and North America developed rapidly based on the combination of imperialist gains and a growing domestic market. This dynamic duo would prolong the existence of global capitalism for more than a century. The objective conditions for revolution declined in the center, while the polarizing dynamics of capitalism trapped the periphery in a deadlock, which made it impossible for it to develop its productive forces and hence creating a revolutionary situation. This is the reason for the wave of revolution in the Third World in the long 60s and the difficulties for building revolutionary organizations in the imperialist center. So I think Oppel's conclusion after the split in CWC would be, no, it's not possible to build a revolutionary organization in an imperialist country, nor are the conditions right for revolution. I agree with Oppel to the extent that, this is Lausen, to the extent that it was certainly not possible to build a revolutionary party based on a mass movement at the time. However, it was possible to make some preparation for this process made by small, dedicated organizations. We managed to continue from 1978 to 1989, and history has shown that such countercurrents have always existed in the imperialist center. In Denmark, there were clandestine support networks for the Spanish communists during the Civil War. That is the pre-World War II Civil War in Spain. And for the Algerian liberation struggle in the beginning of the 1960s. In the US, the Black Panther Party and the Weathermen, the Weather Underground, are examples of communist organizations with a clear anti-imperialist profile. To sustain such organizations, dedication and discipline is needed. In other organizations, I've seen comrades coming and going as it fit their career and other interests. In my part of the world, you can choose to be an anti-imperialist and drop out again as you please. It's not necessary for your existence, nor embedded in the social conditions as in Gaza. However, we do not need dogmatism, but innovation and initiative. We need democracy and procedures to solve conflict that are able to secure the stability of the organization. Evolution of the strategy. When I read our book today, one thing strikes me. It presents an analysis of economic imperialism and the political situation around 1970. However, the book was written 10 years later, in the beginning of the 1980s, when things were already changing. From approximately 1965 to 1975, the contradiction imperialism-anti-imperialism was the principal contradiction in the world system. The anti-imperialist struggle from Vietnam to the Middle East, from Africa to Chile, caused problems for U.S. neocolonialism. We hope that the victory for the liberation struggle in the Third World would cut the suction pipe of imperialism and thereby create a world economic crisis that would put revolution on the agenda, even in the imperialist states. Needless to say, things did not work out that way. The anti-imperialist offensive of the 1960s did not continue in an unabated and continuous course. The opposite aspect of the principal contradiction imperialism evolved and changed character. From the middle of the 1970s, the liberation struggles in the socialist-oriented states of the Third World were put on the defensive. The anti-imperialist aspect of the contradiction was weakened rapidly during the 1980s, a development our analysis had not anticipated and could not explain. One explanation to excuse our poor dialectical analysis might be found in the following quote by French philosopher and friend of Che Guevara, Rishi Debray. We're never completely contemporaneous with our present. History advances in disguise. It appears on stage wearing the mask of the preceding scene, and we tend to lose the meaning of the play. Each time the curtain rises, continuity has to be reestablished. The blame, of course, is not history's, but lies in our vision, encumbered with memory and images learned in the past. We see the past superimposed on the present, even when the present is a revolution. Unquote. We have been so preoccupied with the analysis of the anti-imperialist aspect and of the functioning and consequences of imperialism in the Third World that we had overlooked the evolution of the imperialism aspect itself. Akira Emanuel, had warned us that socialism was not on the agenda in Africa. The development of the productive forces in the newly liberated countries was not sufficient to challenge the capitalist force of the world market. The anti-colonial movements were well aware that the struggle to develop the forces of production was a necessary continuation of national liberation towards socialism. But national self-determination and the ambition to create socialism were not enough to bring about socialism in reality. The conditions were even more difficult for the smaller third world countries than it was for large countries like Russia and China, where more diverse economies, land reforms, and planning made it possible to create more viable transitional economies and mount a defense against hostile imperialist encirclement. The most important barrier for transition towards socialism was the polarizing dynamic caused by the quote-unquote unequal exchange in global capitalism. Raw materials and agricultural products produced by low-wage labor in the third world were exchanged by industrial products produced by relatively high-wage labor in the imperialist center. The newborn revolutionary states did not have the power to change this dynamic. They could not simply increase wages and thereby prices for the raw materials and agricultural products they supplied to the world market. They stood in competition with one another and were forced into a race to the bottom. Without the necessary development and diversity of the productive forces, delinking themselves from the world market and trying to produce solely for the domestic market in the interest of the workers and peasants risked throwing their economies into ruin. They were stuck with monocultures and industries limited to processing a few raw materials. No matter their aspirations, the economies of the newly independent countries were determined by the dominant capitalist realities. Political independence led, in most cases, to capitalist applications of quote-unquote development economics. Unlike their Western colonial predecessors, they could not just transfer the cost of industrialization and welfare to other nations, and therefore most were caught in the quote-unquote development trap. That is, it leads to huge debt and sliding back to an exploited position in global capitalism, like the resource curse, for example. The periphery states managed to achieve national independence, but they did not liberate themselves from imperialist exploitation, and they did not manage to develop a socialist mode of production. It is easy to say that this was inevitable and that the anti-colonial movements should have known better. However, they had little choice. Seizing state power was necessary to at least change the balance of power in international relations. Various attempts to strengthen the political position of the former colonies and newly independent nations shows that at the time it seemed possible to collectively make a difference. Up until the mid-1970s, global capitalism was actually under pressure. The struggle against colonialism and imperialism grew stronger as a U.S. neocolonialism penetrated the third world, replacing the old colonial powers. This contradiction of imperialism versus anti-imperialism interacted with the confrontation between the U.S. and the actually existing socialism of the Soviet Union. Although the split between China and the Soviet Union weakened the Soviet socialist bloc, this is from the 1960s, and socialist movements in general, the two positions, in some peculiar ways, also supplemented each other. While China's Cultural Revolution and Vietnam's armed struggle provided a new revolutionary spirit, the Soviet Union was the necessary nuclear military power which could counterbalance U.S. imperialism on a global scale, so that the revolutionary spirit had the necessary space to flourish without being crushed. The Soviet Union's ability to reciprocate a nuclear attack deterred the U.S. from using nuclear weapons in its imperialist wars. Vietnam took advantage of the quote-unquote best of both worlds. The Soviet Union provided them with anti-aircraft missiles and heavy artillery, alongside existential guarantees to counterbalance the U.S. and avoid a nuclear attack on Hanoi. At the same time, Vietnam waged a protracted people's war on the ground without compromise until its final victory, in tune with Maoist principles. However, the new global wave which came into being was not a world socialist revolution, but neoliberalism. Capitalism still had options for expansion, a new spatial fix in the international division of labor. The forces of the third world were too fragmented and weak to cut the pipelines of imperialism. The socialist camp was split, and the 1968 rebellion in the West was, in the end, more rhetoric than deeds. The G77-77 developing countries within the United Nations system demanded a new international economic world order to give them control over their natural resources and to allow the development of a more equal world system. However, the UN system was blunted. The power rested in the imperialist center, led by the U.S. Formulated in the language of historical materialism was the overarching factor that ended the revolutionary wave of the long 1960s. The inability of actually existing socialism, both the Soviet and Chinese versions, and in the new states in the third world, to develop their productive forces to a sufficient degree to break the dominance of the global capitalist market forces. Because of this, the neoliberal counteroffensive was able to do what the U.S. Army could not do: in Vietnam. That is, put the third world on its knees. Multinational corporations embraced neoliberalism as it promised to relieve the pressure of nation-state regulations on investment and trade. They wanted to move from being multinational to transnational. Neoliberal globalization of industrial production would not have been possible without a certain development of the productive forces, especially in transport, information processing, and communications. The introduction of the standard-sized container, right, modal transport, which could easily be moved from ships to trains and trucks, was one such innovation. The unloading of cargo ships, which once took days, could now be completed within hours. Costs for long-distance shipping were reduced by 97%. Since 1980, container transport by sea has grown by 1,550%. 95% of the foodstuffs, clothes, cars, and electronics we consume are shipped in containers. More than 20 million of them circumnavigate the globe. The biggest cargo ships can carry 20,000, which translates into 40,000 cars, 117 million pairs of shoes, or 745 million bananas. The development of computers, mobile phones, email, the internet, and other forms of communication technology have revolutionized the global stream of information and communication. It became possible to manage and control production over long distances and in detail. One example is the just-in-time managing model. Thank you, Demmer, which minimizes production time as well as storage costs by delivering the material used in production at exactly the right time to the right place. In short, the new communications and logistics innovations became central to the production process. They made it possible to divide the production process into numerous steps that don't need to be closely geographically linked. The components of a car or a refrigerator could be produced and assembled in many different countries. The globalization of production made it possible for capital to free itself from the nation-state's embrace. Production is coordinated in networks and chains, whether they connect different floors in a building or offices, workshops, or factories across the globe. Due to the development of the productive forces in production and transport, the geographic connection between the site of production and consumption became of less importance. The container became the hidden link between the producer countries in the south and the consumer countries in the north. What matters is the price of the factors of production, that is, independent of geographical location, most important being the price of labor power. Capital could employ labor wherever it makes production most profitable. Laborers, on the other hand, are bound to the places where they earn a living by the borders of the national state. Neoliberalism was not just a technical development, it was also about politics. The neoliberal breakthrough occurred when liberal think tanks and lobbyists from multinational corporations connected with conservative political forces. In England, Margaret Thatcher ran against the Labour Party in the 1979 election with the slogan, "There is no alternative." She immediately set about cutting away services provided by the welfare state. What's going on now here? Privatizing public companies and seeking in every way to curtail the influence of the trade union movement. When Ronald Reagan won the U.S. presidential election in 1980, it signaled the global breakthrough of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism combined a market-oriented critique of state regulation of capitalism with an emphasis on individualism rather than community. The social democratic state was criticized for being patronizing and bureaucratic and for depriving people of freedom, responsibility, and initiative. Thatcher wanted to replace what she called the nanny state and its cradle-to-grave coddling with the competition state. Governments across the world system adopted neoliberal policies, modernizing the workflows of the public sector according to the principles of new public management and public choice. They sold off public assets as social housing, railway and bus companies, telecommunications companies, electricity, heating, everything from the water supply to the sewers. The main priority of the competition state is to secure the best possible conditions for capital in competition with other states in the world system. Free from the grip of the social state, from its control of the flow of capital and trade, and from the power of those trade unions, capital could initiate a new transformation of the global division of labor. The new global division of labor. During the past 40 years, there has been a fundamental change in the global division of labor. From capitalism's very beginning up to the 1970s, the countries of the periphery mainly served as sources of raw material and tropical agricultural products, bananas. In the 1950s, industrial goods made up only 15% of the exports of all third world countries combined. By 2009, the number had risen to 70%. Outsourcing of industrial production began in the 1970s with trade capital represented by corporations such as Tesco and Walmart moved the production of shoes, clothes, toys, and kitchenware to low-wage countries. The next wave, the beginning of the 1980s, saw the U.S. electronics giants such as Cisco, Sun Microsystems, Garmin, and AT&T moving their production to South Korea and Taiwan in response to increasing competition from Japan. The latest and strongest wave was prompted when China entered the global market in the 1990s. In total, the global labor force engaged in capitalist production rose from 1.9 to 3.1 billion people between 1980 and 2011. That is an increase of 61%. Three-quarters of this workforce live in the global south. Together, China and India account for 40% of the world's labor force. India joined the WTO in 1995, China in 2001, and the former Soviet republics and the countries of Eastern Europe were integrated into the global capitalist market around the same time. See Ukraine. This meant an expansion of capitalism of historic magnitude and a shift in geographic balance between North and South. In 1980, the numbers of industrial workers in the global South and global North were about equal. In 2010, there were 541 million industrial workers in the global South, while only 145 million remained in the global North. The center of gravity for global industrial production no longer lies in the global North, but in the global South. According to Roy Mauro Marini, capitalist exploitation of the dependent country was mainly based on absolute surplus value, that is, longer working times, higher intensity, blood, sweat, and tears. With a change in the international division of labor created by the neoliberal industrialization of the global South, the relative surplus value, remember that, relative surplus value, new technology and the organization of work was added to the forms of exploitation, not swapped, as it happened to a certain degree in the center throughout the 20th century. In the global South, absolute surplus value continued to play a significant role. The wage level remained low, and the consumption power, which is needed to realize profit, was mainly located in the global North, hence no need for an expansion of the domestic market. In the 1970s, dependency theory showed how the development of the periphery, or more precisely, the lack of it, was dependent on the core countries. By the first decade of the 21st century, the core countries have become dependent on production in the periphery, and the periphery dependent on consumption in the center. This is similar, the overlap. Let me break here for a second. Remind you that port cities function as a kind of center, and of course, the rural areas serve as a kind of periphery in any specific country. To speak of producer economies and consumer economies connected by global chains of production more accurately describes current global economic relationships than the terminology formerly used by dependency theorists. We did not perceive the shift in the relationship between imperialism, that is, transnational monopoly capital, and the social national state in the imperialist countries. Having previously accepted a division of power and a social compromise with the working class in the imperialist countries, capital, now in the form of neoliberalism, launched an offensive against the social national state. This specific form of state had helped capitalism to solve the economic crises of the 1930s, FDR, Nazism, and it had facilitated the development of capitalism in the aftermath of the Second World War. Marshall Plan. The consumption power of the welfare state guaranteed the realization of the profits made by imperialism, as well as the loyalty of the working class in the confrontation with the socialist bloc. However, the social nation state and its control and regulation of the movement of capital, goods, and currency was no longer an asset, but turning into a problem for burgeoning transnational capital by the 1980s. The bulwark of the nation state against the forces of the world market was becoming an intolerable barrier for the development of a more globalized capitalism. We were so preoccupied with our analysis of the anti-imperialism aspect and of imperialism's impact on the third world that we forgot to analyze what was going on in the center. We were aware of the growing significance of transnational corporations in the global south, but not of the increasing contradiction with the social state in the global north. After accepting a class compromise and entering a power-sharing agreement with labor, capital was on the offensive once again in the form of neoliberalism. The shackles of the welfare state with its regulations and control of capital were to be shed. The capital versus the national state contradiction was on the rise as U.S. imperialism versus anti-imperialism declined as the world's principal contradiction. The neoliberal offensive became obvious in the center with Reagan and Thatcher's tax cuts, privatizations, dismantling of public services, and attacks on the trade union movement. Soon, the neoliberal logic spread across the globe. Industrial production was relocated to the global south, and the era of global chains of production and finance capital's exponential growth began. The dialectical relationship between neoliberal politics and ideology and neoliberal economics became a very potent constellation. Neoliberal politics, as a mode of production, unleashed a huge expansion of the productive forces, both in qualitative terms, that is, computers, communications, management, and logistics, and in quantitative terms, that is, the establishment of global production chains. This economic and technological upswing, in turn, strengthened neoliberal politics and ideology. The capitalist counterattack was forceful. Neoliberal became so dominant that capitalism seemed to have conquered the world and was here to stay. On the left, Antonio Negri and Michael Hart declared that globalization would lead to the death of the nation state and the rise of a global empire. But contradictions develop. The strength of their aspects change. They fight and are always in flux, even if we tend to forget that. It often only becomes clear when a certain historical period is over. As Hegel puts it, the owl of Minerva spreads its wings only with the falling of the dusk. Neoliberal lessons for dependency theory. When we, in the manifest version of CWG in the late 1970s, were studying unequal exchange, we were wondering why capital did not move much more industrial production to the global south to take advantage of those low wages. We discussed this with Emmanuel in 1982, going through the draft for our book. He cited several practical, technical, cultural, and political reasons. Transport and communications barriers posed much bigger obstacles than today, as mentioned above. The trade unions still had the strength to resist outsourcing, and the social democratic-led states had the ambition to regulate multinational companies. The polarizing dynamic in global capitalism of the second half of the 19th century and up through the 20th century led the dependency theorists of the 1970s to conclude that the industrialization of the third world was impossible within the imperialist system. They assumed that a substantial domestic market for consumer products had to be developed before industrialization could occur. The third world countries had to de-link, to unblock the development of the productive forces, as Russia in 1917 and China in 1949 had tried. However, this was only an option for very large, diverse economies. Most third world countries would continue to supply raw materials, tropical agricultural products, and simple labor-intensive industrial commodities. Their economies would remain dependent. They would still constitute the periphery of a world system dominated by capitalist states. However, these barriers for industrialization of the global south were knocked down, and this analysis fell apart with the breakthrough of neoliberal globalization. Capitalism was still a dynamic system. It had an ace to play. Its need to expand and its hunger for profit led it to outsource industrial production on a massive scale from the north to the global south. The management of globalized production chains became possible by new forms of communication and new forms of transport, which solved the problem of the geographic distance between the site of production and consumption. The domestic market for consumer goods became less relevant for the industrialization of the South, as it could be substituted by export to the global North. It seemed unthinkable for most dependency theorists in the 70s that only a few decades later, 80% of the world's industrial proletariat would live and work in the global South, and that the global North would be partly deindustrialized. However, Emanuel somehow anticipated this development in 1976. One specific feature of the multinational company, the MNC, which is vaguely considered to generate prejudice, but which, if it really exists, is eminently advantageous, is its independence of the domestic market of the receiving country. Since the main problem of capitalism is not to produce but to sell, less traditional capital was attracted by the low wage rates of certain countries, then was discouraged by the narrowness of the local market associated with such wages. This lack of capital, in turn, prevented growth and hence wage increases. The result was deadlock. In theory, the solution was production for exports alone. But except for standardized primary products, such an operation appeared to transcend the fief of the traditional capitalist. And in any case, it has never occurred. See tariffs. The MNC, with its own sales network abroad and even more its own consumption in the case of a conglomerate, would not be put off by the lack of pre-existing local outlets. It would take advantage of both the low wages of the periphery and the high wages of the center. I have no idea the relative importance of the phenomenon. Here, as elsewhere, statistical information is lacking. Albert Michelet considers that it is very extensive in quantity and very important from the point of view of quality. All I can say is that if this is so, this gives us, for the first time, the possibility of breaking the most pernicious, vicious circle which was holding up the development of the Third World. It is rather a matter for rejoicing. Emanuel was aware of the role that the transnational companies had in the Third World, both in terms of value transfer, but also in terms of developing the productive forces and technology transfer. He shared Marx's dialectical approach concerning the development of capitalism. Marx, on the one hand, affirms the positive progressive features of capitalism: new technology, development of science, industrialization, urbanization, mass literacy, and so on. On the other hand, Marx denounces the exploitation, the human alienation, the commodification of social relations, false ideology, and colonialist genocide, all of which are inherent in the modernization process. This dialectical conception of capitalism permeated Marx's writings. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx describes the rise of capitalism as a progressive stage of historical development. In the first pages, he describes modern industry, modern workers, modern state power, modern productive forces, and modern relations of production. In the preface to Capital, Marx writes that the purpose of the book is to disclose the economic law of motion of modern society. Marx defended modernity because it prepared the way to a more fully developed modernity, which is socialism. When we analyze the role of transnational companies in development, we must make sure to distinguish between when we discuss development inside the framework of the capitalist mode of production, or when we discuss the possibility of the appropriation of the productive forces by the people, the transfer to a new mode of production. In the end of the 20th century, the capitalist mode of production was, for sure, still vital and dominated the world system. A transformation of the mode of production was not on the agenda. Capitalism in the global North was bad, but underdeveloped capitalism in the South was worse. From the mid-1970s until the turn of the millennium, neoliberalism was on the offensive. First, it weakened the state at home through the deregulation of transnational movements of capital and trade, privatization, and cuts in welfare. Then transnational capital outsourced jobs to low-wage countries for higher profits. However, the social consequences of these acts began to change the balance between aspects. The outsourcing of jobs, erosion of the welfare state, and migration problems generated nationalism in the North, demanded a stronger national state as a bulwark against the negative impact of global market forces. The structural adjustments of neoliberalism in the global South had the same effect. By the turn of the millennium, the negative social consequences of neoliberalism began to weaken the political dominance of its institutions. The financial crisis of 2007 to 2008 strengthened the demand for state control of capital. The balance in the neoliberal contradiction tipped towards nationalism and the nation state. The financial crisis of 2007-2008 was a wake-up call to the Chinese leadership. They realized that neoliberalism was no longer a dynamic force to develop the productive forces, but increasingly a problem in the form of economic stagnation, social inequality, and environmental problems. With Xi Jinping in power in 2012, China began to shift the cycle of capital accumulation from being focused on the world market to more emphasis on domestic circulation. By tripling the wage level and massive state programs for internal investment that have pulled millions out of poverty in the countryside. After its encounter with neoliberalism, China emerged as a major economic power. China was able, for the first time in 200 years, to break the polarizing dynamic of capitalism between the center and the periphery. It is a historical break of significant size. A nation of 1.4 billion people made the change from one of the poorest countries on earth in 1949 to the leading industrial power in the world system with 35% of the world's gross production, compared with the US's 12%. The consequence was an increasing discordance between global capitalism and China's national project of development. From neoliberal globalization to geopolitical confrontation, with the crises of global neoliberalism from 2007, the decline of the U.S. hegemony, the rise of China, and the development towards a multipolar world system, the world is undergoing a profound change not seen in the past 100 years. The global trade pattern is under transformation. After 200 years, north-south trade is declining, and south-south trade is on the rise. See BRICS. This is manifested by huge development in transport and infrastructure projects in the global south, facilitating this new trade pattern, Belt and Road. The global value transfer of unequal exchange from south to north has begun to decline for the first time in 150 years, from a zenith in 2011 of $2.9 trillion to $2.3 trillion in 2017. The rising wage levels in China are contributing to this decline. Between 1978 and 2018, on average, 1 hour of work in the United States was exchanged for almost 40 hours of Chinese work. However, from the middle of the 1990s, we observed a very marked decrease in unequal exchange, without it completely disappearing. In 2018, 6.4 hours of Chinese labor were still exchanged for 1 hour of U.S. labor. Besides the transfer of value from south to north by unequal exchange, debt, DEBT, has contributed to solving the problem of lack of consumption power in the global capitalist accumulation circuit by pushing the problem of imbalance between production and consumption into the future. See Republicans. The amount of debt has grown steadily in the history of capitalism and accelerated in the past decade, not least during the COVID-19 epidemic. Global debt of governments, corporations, and households stood at 120% of global GDP in 1980. By 2021, global debt reached 355% of global GDP, which means that during the neoliberal era, debt grew 3 times faster than global production. This debt bubble can burst in a major financial crisis and throw the system into deep crises. A special form of creating consumption power is printing money without backing in expanded production, as the U.S. has done in the past 50 years. The U.S. can do this because the dollar has the status of world money in trade and international finance, a position reached by U.S. political dominance in the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF and the World Bank. And who started these? Yes, it was the U.S. Trillions of dollars are circulating as payment in trade and financial transactions and are stored as deposits in banks. The U.S. gets commodities and services for these dollars as they enter the world market, but they never return as claims on commodities produced in the U.S. A precondition for this advantage is the continued U.S. dominance in world finance. However, this has changed The transformation in trade structure is accompanied by changes in finance and banking in the world system. Alternatives to the Bretton Woods institutions are being developed in the context of BRICS Plus. This gives the global south possibilities to invest and trade in their own currency instead of dollars and lend money without structural adjustments and other political conditions. In the 1970s, we hoped that the Third World liberation movements would cut off the pipelines of value transfer, but capitalism was still vital. Neoliberal globalization offered an escape route. However, now it seems that the capitalist mode of production has reached the limit of exploitation of the proletariat in the periphery, and it is on a collision course with the global ecosystem. Capitalism is no longer progressive in terms of development of the productive forces. It is becoming irrational, destructive, and prevents progress for humanity. We are approaching this situation where they're becoming fetters of development. The center no longer has the advantage of a monopoly of high-tech industrial production, and they are losing the grip of global finance. To uphold its hegemony, the U.S. is now splitting and eroding the neoliberal world market. See tariffs, which has served them so well for 50 years, providing huge profits and cheap commodities for consumers in the global north. They are doing it by trade wars, sanctions, and blockades. The formerly mighty World Trade Organization, which settles international trade disputes, has been weakened by Trump and Biden as its verdicts now go counter to U.S. interests. The U.S. turned to political pressure and military means in a geopolitical struggle for dominance. This strategy is not an expression of strength, but of weakness. The division of labor created by neoliberal globalization, with Asia as the factory of the world and the West as consumer societies, meant that the geopolitical importance of controlling trading routes became paramount. Hence the importance of the gateway to Asia in the north, Ukraine, and in the south, Palestine, the Suez, the Persian Gulf, and the Red Sea. In a geopolitical struggle, NATO, led by the U.S., is trying to secure dominance of the Euro-Asian corridor and get a regime change in Russia and China to pro-Western Yeltsin-type governments. Through the proxy war on Ukrainian soil between Russia and NATO, the U.S. has disciplined Europe back under its command. Well, maybe. The U.S. is dragging Europe into the confrontation with Russia, China, Iran, Cuba, Venezuela, and the global south in general. Yes, they are. NATO membership is not an a la carte dish. Europe must swallow the whole American menu, including U.S. policy in the Middle and Far East. The contradiction of the endgame. Marx underestimated the longevity of capitalism, as did Lenin and Mao. Many of us in the 1968 generation have predicted the end of capitalism several times, and our hopes for world revolution were frustrated. This has led to the mistaken belief that capitalism can assimilate all critiques and innovate out of all problems. Universalization of the present denies the historic specificity, and transitory character of capitalist social relations. Capitalism has successfully reproduced its existence for 200 years, but there are limits to this reproduction. It is not a system in balance. The polarized development between center and periphery generated by the imperialist value transfer enabled it to reproduce itself. However, this dynamic is challenged by the rise of China. Like the late Emanuel Wallerstein, I believe the decline of U.S. hegemony forebodes the end of capitalism. This will not take place within a decade, oh, darned, but it seems clear that the 21st century is the autumn of the capitalist system. The industrialization of the global south in recent decades signals a significant change in the dynamics of global capitalism itself. The system is losing the balancing force of the center-periphery dichotomy. Certainly, an industrialized global south will not develop into a prosperous capitalism as in northwestern Europe and North America. Neither China, India, Indonesia, nor Brazil has a periphery to exploit substantial enough to feed the development of welfare capitalism, and ecologically, the world cannot sustain such a capitalist world system. However, the development of the productive forces in the global south will threaten the privileged positions of the U.S. and the EU and accelerate the crises of global capitalism. From the global north, the U.S., in its desperate struggle to uphold its hegemony, is disrupting the imperialist pipeline system of globalized production and trade. From the southern flank, China has succeeded in diminishing the imperial rent of unequal exchange. while simultaneously breaking the technological monopoly of Western corporations and financial institutions, darn those computers, providing an alternative for the global South in their economic development. In the end game, global capitalism will be haunted by economic crises generated by the inherent contradiction between the need to expand production and the lack of corresponding consumption power. Profits will decline and accumulation will come to a halt. The development of the productive forces in the global South signals not only a shift in the dynamics of capitalism, but also enhances the material conditions for the development of socialism. The current principal contradiction. What is the driving force in this transition? The first step in answering this question is to identify the principal contradiction, as this will tell us where to start and as a guide for further analysis. If the development of global capitalism and the world system of states is one process, then at any given point in time, this process has a principal contradiction emerging from the multiple contradictions in the capitalist mode of production, driving its development forward. The principal contradiction affects regional, national, local contradictions decisively. However, the interaction between the principal contradiction and national and local contradictions is not one-sided. Due to feedback effects, local contradictions affect the principal contradiction as they push and change the relations between the aspects of the principal contradiction. Since the late 1970s, the principal contradiction has been between transnational capital's neoliberal globalization project and the nation-state's attempt to regulate capitalism. Until the turn of the millennium, transnational capital was the dominant aspect of this contradiction. However, the consequences of neoliberalism in both the global North and the global South generated nationalist demands for a stronger state as bulwarks against globalization. In the past decades, globalized capitalism and its institutions came under increasing pressure from both right and left-wing nationalist forces. The international division of labor created by neoliberal outsourcing has changed the power structure in the world system. Northern transnational capital turned China into the factory of the world. Remember, that used to be the title for America, but it did not manage to keep China as a periphery of the center. China broke the historical polarizing tendency in the capitalist mode of production. China used the neoliberal intrusion to develop its national project. That is, yes, socialism with Chinese characteristics. The US, the EU, Japan, New Zealand, and Australia have united to uphold US hegemony. They constitute one aspect of the current principal contradiction. The other aspect is headed by China, allied with a conglomerate of states, which, for different reasons, are opposed to the continuation of US hegemony and want a multipolar world system. They are united in the ambition to change the North-South structure, which has dominated the world system for the last 2 centuries, and expand South-South relations. The U.S. can no longer uphold its hegemony by economic and financial means, but must rely on its military power. The decline of neoliberalism is not in the interest of transnational capital, which is dependent on their global production chains to generate surplus value and access to the entire world market to realize the profit. If the 2007-8 crisis was the crisis of financial neoliberalism, then the current crisis is the crisis of globalized production. However, transnational capital cannot distance itself from its political leadership, which provides security for its operation. There is no way out of the dilemma for transnational capital, as it is the crisis of neoliberalism itself, which has created this situation. The immediate need of political imperialism overrides the interests of transnational capital. U.S. policy is becoming self-destructive. It shatters the world market, on which it has built its power since the end of the Second World War. Its political system erodes from within as the elite is split, a split that continues down to the people of the U.S. The only vision is, quote-unquote, making America great again, which is not shared by the rest of the world. The disintegration of globalization is a reconfiguration of the power structure in the world system. In retrospect, China was admitted into the global trade regime in 1972, Nixon, because of the U.S. rivalry with its chief opponent, the Soviet Union. Beating the Soviets first, then China, was the plan. U.S. superiority in technology and finance at the time gave it the confidence to open its global trade regime to any country willing to play the game, regardless of ideology. In this phase, all those blue jeans, the globalization regime was a gigantic profit machine based on global production chains and extraction of cheap production factors from the global south. Today, as the U.S. is no longer economically competitive, it uses instead its military power in alliance with Europe and Japan for geopolitical struggle to rule the world system. Socialism or barbarism? 2 months before his death in 2019, Emmanuel Wallerstein um, wrote his ultimate commentary. This is the end. It's the Doors. This is the beginning. Leaving his final reflection, the world might go down further bypaths, or it might not. I have indicated in the past that I thought the crucial struggle is a class struggle, using class in a very broadly defined sense. What those who will be alive in the future can do is to struggle with themselves so this change may be a real one. I still think that, and therefore I think there's a 50-50 chance that we'll make it to transformatory change, but only 50-50. This is a bit like Rosa Luxemburg's statement in her 1916 anti-war pamphlet, The Crisis of German Social Democracy. Quote, bourgeois society stands at the crossroads. Bourgeois society stands at the crossroads. Either transition to socialism or regression into barbarism. Or Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifesto, speaking of class struggles, resulting in, quote, either a revolutionary constitution of society at large or the common ruin of the contending classes, unquote. The end game of capitalism takes place within a framework of its structural crisis economically, politically, and ecologically. The structural crisis entails that the system is out of balance and that conjunctions do not come in regular waves, but by sudden, uncontrollable swings. We have reached the stage in the history of the planet Earth where capitalism is the main driver of systemic changes, disrupting ecological balances and expediting gradual changes over millennia to now occur in decades. A revolutionary break with capitalism is not just a question of removing capitalism's fetters on human development. It is necessary to stop the destruction of the Earth. Climate change is a reality. It is the rate of destruction that's unclear. Where will the next disaster strike? And how big will it be? The growing ecological and climatic problems, as well as the scramble for the Earth's natural resources, can trigger revolutionary situations as it changes living conditions, causing natural disasters and refugee movement. We're under time pressure to make the transition due to capitalism's continuing impact on climate change. If we move into the second half of this century, some kind of lifeboat socialism may be the only solution to climate change and destruction of the Earth's ecosystem. Then there's the danger of nuclear war in a world system with intensified geopolitical struggle induced by the declining hegemon. The U.S. is the world's mightiest military power. Europe is arming at an unprecedented scale. NATO stands for 60% of the world's total military expenses, Russia 4%, China 13%. It is the U.S. which has more than 900 military bases all over the world with a common slogan, no beach, out of reach. Many states in the world system have, and more states are acquiring nuclear weapons and the means to launch them, increasing the mathematical risks of mass destruction. A war between the world's leading powers could very well become the world's principal contradiction if they escalate into the use of nuclear weapons. While nuclear weapons are essentially defensive weapons, the decision to use nuclear weapons is in the hands of individual, sometimes irrational human beings. The end of capitalism can be chaos or a transition to socialism. It depends on the outcome of our struggle. Anti-imperialism today. What a magazine. Anti-imperialism today cannot be the same as it was in the long 1960s. History does not repeat itself. It moves ahead. The high revolutionary spirit and the success of the anti-colonial struggle from the late 1940s until mid-1970s were due to a combination of contradictions in the world system. The contradiction between the socialist bloc versus the U.S., and the contradiction between the emerging third world on one side and U.S. neocolonialism on the other side. This set of interlinked global contradictions opened up a wave of anti-imperialist liberation struggles with a socialist perspective across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. All this changed with the counteroffensive of neoliberal globalization from the mid-1970s. It became difficult to continue national liberation into a socialist transformation. However, neoliberalism was not the end of history. The result of outsourcing of industrial production was, on the one hand, the transfer of value from south to north. However, on the other hand, the development of productive forces in the global south began to break up the century-old polarization between a rich north and a poor south. In the 1970s, the Third World demanded a new world order, which came to nothing. Today, the global south is creating a new world order. One example is BRICS, the cooperation between Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, which was enlarged in September 2022, now comprising 46% of the world's population and 36% of the world economy, counterbalancing the G7, US, Canada, the UK, France, Italy, Germany, and Japan, with only 10% of the world population and 30% of the world economy. In the future, BRICS Plus will further outweigh the G7. BRICS Plus is not an anti-capitalist organization, but it is a step in the right direction. The emerging multipolar world system consists of a complex of contradictory currents between hegemonism and counter-hegemonism, conservative and progressive, capitalist and socialist forces. This is how the world looks. We have to keep in mind Marx's words that no social order disappears before all the productive forces for which there is space have been developed. We're reaching this point. Then, as Marx continues, comes the period of social revolution. The challenge is to navigate in this sea of interconnected contradictions. We're almost done. Like in the 1960s, the contradiction between the North trying to uphold its hegemony and the global South can create space for movements and nations advancing towards socialism. The development of the productive forces in the global South has placed them in a much better position to achieve this goal than in the 60s. The U.S. is still the dominant aspect in the principal contradiction, but the South is on the offensive, encircling the center. While the transformative power of the Third World in the 60s was based on the revolutionary spirit, the attempted ideological dominance over the economic development, the current transformative power of the global South is based on its economic strength. Things may develop faster than we expect. The next decades will be dramatic and dangerous. The transition will not be a tea party or a dinner party. We will see sudden changes in political alliances, and in this scenario, we need to stay the course and stick to a clear socialist perspective. At the same time, we're working under time pressure due to climate change. From utopian socialism to realizing socialism. A rigid and idealistic perception of socialism in national and international struggles obscures the complexity and changeability of current class behaviors and interests. Again, with Marx's words in mind, the new relations of production never appear before the material conditions of their existence have matured in the womb of the old society. Ooh, it's like alien. There is not and has never been any pure socialism in the world. It's not possible. It cannot exist in the real world of dominating capitalism. Only transitional modes of production and states have existed. Socialism is a project under construction, and the first step is to cut loose from the shackles of capitalism controlled by the U.S. We are not to be utopians. Our development of socialism must be based on dialectical and historical materialism. The attempts to build socialism in the past 2 centuries must be seen as part of a long transition process, rather than a row of failures, attempts which have contributed to the progress of the transition by modifying capitalism, as well as the learning process for building socialism. The development of socialism contains negations, imperfections, and impurities. Mistakes were made. As it is developed in the reality of the capitalist world of production, anti-imperialist strategy must contain real existing concrete counter-hegemonic forces capable of challenging the dominant power structure. It is not enough to wish for some pure, self-organized workers' movement, workers' councils, to take state power from above if you cannot point to its real existence. Western Marxists are often trapped in a utopian world where the idea of socialism is superior to the transitional regimes and modes of production, which have emerged in the past 100 years, struggling against a dominant capitalist world system. The Brazilian communist Jones Manuel writes, "Nothing is socialist transition and everything is state capitalism. The contradictions, the problems, the failures, the mistakes, sometimes even the crimes, mainly happen during this moment of building the new order. So when the time comes to evaluate the building of a new social order, which is where apparently the practice always seemed to stray from the purity of theory, the specific appears corrupted in the face of the universal," all you Bernie bros. The support for a multipolar world system does not imply avoiding criticism of reactionary tendencies within the BRICS Plus states. We must support the Chinese peasants and workers in their class struggle to move towards socialism, which means getting rid of remaining capitalist elements, national or transnational. 40 years of opening up to neoliberalism has had an impact on Chinese society. This must be changed. However, an understanding of the dilemmas and the balance between the needs for national development within the capitalist mode of production versus advancing socialism nationally and globally is important on how to relate to the transitional states in order to defend them against imperialism, but also to advance the transition to socialism. We must support the transitional states' nationalist aspect against the hostile capitalist states, not only to defend their attempt to develop socialism, but also because they are an essential anti-imperialist component, balancing imperialism and providing breathing space for socialist movements in the remaining capitalist world systems. However, we must also push for a socialist transformation by class struggle wherever we can to ensure that the socialist aspect dominates the national aspect in the contradictions of the transitional state. Just as the Soviet Union balanced U.S. imperialism, making national liberation possible, China balances the U.S., making economic delinking from Western capitalist dominance possible. To avoid the collapse of capitalism into a chaotic abyss, a strong China will be of decisive importance for a global transformation to socialism. The prospects of socialism. We're getting close to the end. It'll be over in about, 7 minutes or so. In the past century, only a revolutionary process led by communist parties could unblock the development of the productive forces in the periphery of the world system and get the wheels of the economy running again by initiating the development of a transitional mode of production. It had to be a transitional mode because the world system was dominated by capitalism, still is. The lack of development of productive forces in the periphery and the hostile world system hindered an immediate transition to a more advanced socialist modernity. This is the history of the Soviet and Chinese revolutions and other efforts to move towards socialism in the 20th century. In developing this transitional mode of production, they had to adopt the same dialectic as expressed by Marx between the progressive role of capitalism and the agony it produces. Lenin did not believe that socialism was equivalent to the collectivization of poverty. To overcome mass poverty, the Soviet Union was compelled to develop the productive forces, build all those locomotives. In the new economic policy, the NEP, the Bolsheviks used the technology and management associated with capitalism to boost production. However, the commanding heights of the economy, finance, infrastructure, large industry, and mining remained in the hands of the state, hence the accusation of state capitalism. To avoid getting crushed by German imperialism, the Soviet Union had to go through an accelerated industrialization during the 1930s with huge human costs, all that coal shoveling. In 1949, China was in a similar position as Russia in 1917. The development of productive forces and technology was among the lowest in the world. China was forcefully isolated and could not import technology from the West. However, the Soviet Union came to its rescue in 1950 and provided China access to its technology. But due to political disagreement, Soviet technology was cut off in the late 1950s. Darn that great leap. And China was again isolated from the surrounding world economy. In the 1970s, under pressure from neoliberal globalization, China had no choice but to build its peculiar form of state capitalism and market socialism to maintain its national project. It could not develop its productive forces without investments in trading with capitalist countries. China had to open up to acquire the appropriate technology to develop its productive forces to continue the development of socialism with Chinese characteristics. Deng Xiaoping's reform strategy does not stem from a neoliberal perspective. Much to some people's chagrin. He advocated for the acceleration of foreign investment capital, believing that planning and markets could not be applied to serve the development of a socialist system. Nor did Deng introduce economic shock therapy as Yeltsin did in the post-Soviet era. With a reference to Lenin's NEP policy in the Soviet Union, Deng said that socialism does not mean shared property. In an interview with CBS in 1986, he explained his approach. According to Marxism, communist society is based on material abundance. Only when there's a material abundance can the principle of a communist society, that is, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs, be applied. There can be no communism with pauperism or socialism with pauperism. Wealth in a socialist society belongs to the people. To get rich in a socialist society means prosperity for the entire people. The principles of socialism are first, production, development of production, and second, common prosperity. We permit some people and some regions to become prosperous first for the purpose of achieving common prosperity faster. Hence, China or any other transitionary state should not attempt to avoid contact with globalized capitalism, as they cannot carry on the transformation process towards socialism in isolation from a capitalist mode of production, which is still vital, developing the productive forces and hence a source of advanced technology. Supercomputers. In addition, the transitional state's interaction with global capitalism is part of the transition process as it modifies and presents itself as an alternative to capitalism. However, socialism with Chinese characteristics or any other national form is only one step. Socialism does not only imply the eradication of poverty within the national framework, but also global equality. It is not possible to raise the living standards of billions of people in the global south to the level of the US or Germany within the capitalist mode of production. To accommodate their needs, it is not only a change in the relations of production and patterns of production, which is needed to develop socialism on a global scale, it is also a continued development of the productive forces and the implementations of the most advanced technologies. Now, let me skip a manual here. And then there's on advanced capitalism, and I know this is going to drone on, but let's just end with the what can we do? What is to be done? What is to be dumb? You can read the rest of this. The world's unification has ceased to be an option. It has become a condition of its existence. That's really important. But the basic structure is the same. We're still in the center periphery. There's still pockets of the third world in the center, and an imperial mode of living in certain countries, and class layers in the global south, for example, in the Arabian Gulf. Now, so there's a whole business about reconciling the local with the global, and stuff's happened. There's stuff that needs to happen, and I think most of them have been spelled out. And the war in Gaza, of course. The war in Gaza since October 23, this was written before October 7th, has created a new generation of anti-imperialists in the global north has not seen since the protests against the Vietnam War, the mobilization of solidarity with the Palestinian struggle. It's also a schooling and organization learning how the system works, the powerful instruments of the state, the media, and imperialism in general. Anti-imperialists will be a minority, but an important minority. In the solidarity movement with Palestine, we see the local people standing shoulder to shoulder with Palestinians in the diaspora. Refugees and migrant workers can be an anti-imperialist Trojan horse within the global north, and that's what they're worried about. That's why people are getting arrested, etc. Because of their position in production and services, they are not powerless, and their affiliation with family and hope for the economic development of their homelands in the global south may be stronger than their loyalty to a state that barely tolerates their stay. Let me end this text by summing up what communists in the global north can do in a program. There are 23 of them. I'll just read a couple. I think you can see where this is headed. Capitalism has been imperialistic since its beginning as the dominant mode of production in the world system. As such, it cannot reproduce or maintain itself without imperialism. Yeah, it's sort of a tautology, right? Imperialism is a global system of value transfer characterized by a hierarchical system of states that compete with each other for their share in captured value. Value transfer is facilitated by economic mechanisms, while war, geopolitics, culture, and ideology reproduce it and maintain it. The value flows from the periphery to the core and beyond capitalist profits, provides a material basis for higher living standards of the working and middle strata of the states pertaining to the core. Hence, imperialism proposes material incentives to the global north workers to maintain the status quo and to improve its position within the existing political and economic order constituting the so-called labor aristocracy. See, professional and managerial class. Any action, ideology, and movement that challenges the existing capitalist world system and aims to transform it, to abolish imperialism in favor of a new just society, free of oppression and exploitation, we denote as anti-systemic. We oppose the ideological tendencies identified as Western Marxism, that's an important point, that negate the role, importance, or even existence of imperialism in the world system, that deny the agency of the people in the third world in systemic change, that oppose the national and anti-colonial struggle of the oppressed people, and that reject the legacy and lessons, positive and negative equally, of actually existing socialist states. 7, we oppose all other ideologies that perpetuate national, racial, ethnic, gendered, religious division and oppression, as it is a basis for super exploitation and, as such, for the reproduction of the imperialist system. See anti-Semitism. We are firm in defense of ideas, movements, communities, and states that wage the anti-systemic struggle for a new world system without imperialism. We are open to all ideas that follow the above parameters. And now there's strategy and, other stuff, and it goes to 23. And I'm going to stop now because you're probably not alive. But let me see if there are any comments in the chat. I've scared people away. No, there are no comments. This is all right. Well, having seen that, we stop the